Imagine waking up one day to a silence so heavy, it feels as if the world itself is holding its breath. The room is the same as it was yesterday, the bed unmade, the curtains half drawn, the same cracks spiderwebbing across the ceiling. And yet, something is different. Something invisible has shifted. You feel it pressing down on your chest like a weight you can't name. You didn't kill anyone. You didn't steal. You didn't break the law. And still, there it is, a gnawing presence that clings to your ribs, whispering in the dark. You are guilty, but guilty of what? This is the question that haunted Fyodor Dostoevsky throughout his life and bled into every page of his novels. For him, guilt was not just the consequence of committing a crime. It was not something you could scrub away in courtrooms or silence with forgiveness. No, guilt to Dostoevsky was something far deeper, far more insidious. It was the echo of conscience, the shadow of human freedom, the invisible mark every man carries, whether he deserves it or not. And here is the paradox. How can you feel guilt for something you have never done? How can the heart carry a burden heavier than the crime itself when the crime was never committed? Think of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, a young man convinced that greatness permits him to murder. And yet, long before the police find him, long before anyone even suspects him, his guilt begins to devour him alive. His skin burns. His mind races. His sleep is shattered by feverish dreams of blood and horses beaten in the street. The punishment begins not with handcuffs, but with the mind turning against itself. Dostoevsky shows us something terrifying. The human soul does not wait for justice to be served. It creates its courtroom, its executioner, its eternal sentence. But what does that mean for you? What if the guilt you carry is not the result of some great crime, but simply the unbearable awareness of your freedom, the knowledge that you could destroy, betray, or wound at any moment? What if guilt is less about what you've done and more about what you are capable of doing? Consider this. You walk down a crowded street. Faces blur past you. You brush shoulders with strangers you will never see again. At any second, the thought flashes. You could trip someone into traffic. You could scream obscenities. You could grab. You could strike. You don't, of course. But the mere possibility lingers in your chest like a ghost, the dark potential of the human animal. Is this why Dostoevsky insisted that every man carries the guilt of all mankind? Because within you, as within me, as within everyone who has ever lived, lies the potential for betrayal, cruelty, even murder. And if that is true, then guilt is not a sign of weakness, but of awareness. Maybe guilt is the mirror that forces us to see the abyss inside ourselves, the reminder that we are not simply innocent bystanders in the drama of existence, but participants who must choose, again and again, whether to build or to destroy. But here's the great question. If guilt can exist without crime, if it is woven into the very structure of human freedom, then what hope do we have of ever escaping it? Dostoevsky himself was no stranger to this torment. Arrested for political dissent, dragged before a firing squad, and sentenced to death, he stood staring into the abyss of his final moments, only to be forgiven at the last instant and sent to Siberia for years of exile and suffering. Can you imagine what that does to a man's soul? To know that you were seconds away from execution, only to live on with the memory of your almost death branded into your mind? For Dostoevsky, this experience planted an unshakable conviction. Guilt is not just what you feel for your actions, but the unbearable awareness of your existence itself, the crushing knowledge that you are alive when others are not, that your choices matter, that your freedom can never be erased. And so the question becomes even more urgent. If guilt is inescapable, if it haunts us even in our most innocent moments, then what is its purpose? Is guilt the curse of humanity, condemning us to endless suffering? Or is it, paradoxically, the very thing that makes us human, the hidden thread that binds us to morality, compassion, and meaning? The answer is not simple, and Dostoevsky never gives us one wrapped in neat resolution. Instead, he drags us deeper, into the labyrinth of conscience, where guilt is both poison and medicine, curse and blessing, torment and salvation. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the real danger is not guilt itself, but the attempt to escape it. Because once you deny guilt, once you bury it, once you pretend it isn't there, you open the door to something far darker. And it is here, in this tension, that our journey begins. What is it that makes guilt so unbearable? Why does it crawl under the skin, linger in the marrow, and refuse to leave, even when no crime has been committed? To answer this, we must step deeper, beyond the courtroom, beyond the confessional booth, beyond the surface explanations of religion or law. We must look at guilt as Dostoevsky saw it, not as a passing emotion, but as a fundamental condition of the human soul. The hidden problem of guilt lies in its origin. Most people assume guilt comes after an action. I stole, therefore I feel guilty. I lied, therefore I feel guilty. I betrayed, therefore I feel guilty. But Dostoevsky, and many of the great psychological thinkers after him, revealed something darker. Guilt often comes before the action. It is not merely a reaction, it is anticipation. It is the shadow of what we might do, what we could do, what we fear we are capable of. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the hidden reservoir of impulses we deny, repress, and exile into the unconscious. Every civilized mask you wear, every smile, every polite word, is built on top of that repressed shadow. You do not scream in public. You do not strike your enemies in the open. You do not indulge every forbidden desire, not because you are incapable, but because you know you are capable, and society demands you suppress it. Yet the suppression does not erase the impulse. It simply drives it underground, where it festers, where it whispers. And guilt, in this sense, is the body's alarm bell, reminding you of what lurks within. Nietzsche would not have disagreed, though he would have phrased it differently. For him, guilt was not just an inner alarm, but a weapon, a cultural invention used to tame the human animal. In On the Genealogy of Morality, he argued that primitive man, wild and unrestrained, was forced into obedience by guilt. Debt and punishment were the chains that tied the beast of instinct to the order of society. You owe me, therefore, you must obey. You are guilty, therefore you must repent. In Nietzsche's view, guilt was not born in the heavens but in the marketplace, an economic and psychological contract that enslaved the individual to systems of power. And yet, Dostoevsky complicates this further. Because in his vision, guilt is not only imposed from the outside, it erupts from within. Even when there is no priest to condemn you, no judge to sentence you, no neighbor to gossip about you, guilt grows like a sickness in the soul. Why? Because guilt is tied to freedom. Arthur Schopenhauer once declared that man is free to do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. In other words, we are bound by forces deeper than our conscious choices, drives, instincts, hungers we do not control. But Dostoevsky seems to turn this on its head. For him, the very fact that we can choose, that we can will something terrible, is enough to breed guilt. Freedom itself becomes unbearable because freedom contains the possibility of evil. The awareness that you could destroy everything at any moment is a secret too heavy to carry, and guilt is the constant reminder of that secret. This is why so many of Dostoevsky's characters seem to self-destruct long before external punishment arrives. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment does not need the police to torture him. His conscience gnaws at him like a rat. Dmitry Karamazov, accused of patricide in The Brothers Karamazov, confesses to crimes he did not commit, because the guilt he carries is larger than any single deed. Prince Mishkin, the holy fool in The Idiot, suffers not from his sins, but from the unbearable compassion he feels for the sins of others. The hidden problem, then, is this. Guilt is not tied to specific acts, but to the human condition itself. It is not something you can erase by apologizing or compensating. It is woven into your very freedom. The more conscious you become of your possibilities, the more guilt begins to stalk you. But here lies another paradox. Guilt is both destructive and necessary. Without guilt, there is no conscience. Without guilt, there is no boundary between good and evil. Without guilt, The murderer feels nothing. The liar sleeps peacefully. The tyrant rules without nightmares. Guilt is the price we pay for having a conscience, for being human instead of a beast. And yet, the same guilt that protects us can also imprison us, paralyzing action, breeding despair, creating endless cycles of self-loathing. This tension fascinated Dostoevsky because he saw it everywhere, in the courtrooms of St. Petersburg, in the Siberian prison camps, in the faces of beggars and nobles alike. He saw a society trying desperately to explain guilt away, to reduce it to legal codes or psychiatric diagnoses, when in truth guilt is older than any institution. Guilt is metaphysical. It cannot be measured, cannot be contained, cannot be reasoned away. And perhaps this is why Dostoevsky's work remains psychologically explosive, because even modern psychology, with its vocabulary of repression, projection, and trauma, cannot fully explain why a man can wake up feeling guilty when he has done nothing wrong. Why survivors of tragedy feel guilty for being alive. Why do children feel guilty for their parents' misery? Why do lovers feel guilty for the suffering of their beloved? There is something primal here, something that goes beyond logic. A secret. Knowledge that existence itself carries responsibility. Jean-Paul Sartre captured this when he said, "Man is condemned to be free." Condemned, not blessed. Because freedom is not lightness, it is weight. It is the crushing awareness that every action you take defines you, and every inaction too. To live is to choose, and to choose is to bear guilt. For what you did, and for what you could have done but didn't. This is the hidden root. Guilt is not a glitch of the human psyche. It is the very ground we stand on. It is the shadow cast by freedom itself. And if that is true, then the real question is no longer, why do we feel guilty? The real question is, what do we do with this guilt? Because if guilt is inevitable, then the way we carry it, the way we interpret it, the way we respond to it, will decide whether it destroys us or saves us. And this leads us to the next, even darker revelation: the unseen consequences of guilt. If guilt is inevitable, then its consequences ripple far beyond the individual. It doesn't just live inside your chest like a parasite. It shapes entire lives, societies, and destinies. Dostoevsky understood this better than anyone. He saw guilt not as a private emotion, but as a force capable of breaking men, poisoning relationships, and steering the fate of nations. At the individual level, the most immediate consequence of guilt is self-punishment. Human beings are strangely wired to inflict suffering on themselves when guilt cannot be cleansed. Some cut themselves down with inner voices of shame. Some sabotage opportunities, relationships, and even their happiness, as if to say, "I don't deserve this." Others gravitate toward destructive habits, alcohol, gambling, violence, as if each act of self-ruin were a twisted attempt at redemption. Dostoevsky's characters are filled with this pathology, men and women destroying themselves, not because society demands it, but because guilt whispers that they must. Consider Raskolnikov again. His crime is murder, but his true punishment begins long before prison. He isolates himself, lashes out at those who love him, wanders through feverish delirium, unable to escape the relentless echo of his conscience. It is as if the human soul has a secret law. The deeper the guilt, the harsher the self-imposed punishment. In Dostoevsky's world, no whip or chain compares to the torment of one's thoughts. But guilt is not only self-destructive, it is contagious. It spills outward, infecting those around us. Families often become prisons of inherited guilt. A father's shame becomes the son's burden. A mother's self-blame becomes the daughter's inheritance. Dostoevsky knew this well. In The Brothers, Karamazov, guilt is never confined to the individual. When the father, Fyodor Pavlovich, is murdered, suspicion spreads like a plague among his sons. Dmitri is accused, Ivan suffers a mental breakdown, and Alyosha takes on the role of silent redeemer. The crime belongs to one man, but the guilt belongs to them all. This reflects a terrifying truth. Guilt has a way of transcending boundaries. Survivors of war feel guilty for being alive. Children of oppressors feel guilty for crimes they never committed. Even entire nations carry collective guilt, generations later, for atrocities buried under the soil. Dostoevsky hinted at this collective dimension long before psychology gave it language. To him, guilt was never private. It was communal, inescapable, and infinite. But perhaps the most dangerous consequence of guilt is paralysis. When guilt festers without resolution, it robs you of the will to act. You become trapped in endless cycles of self-reproach, unable to move forward. This is where Dostoevsky's characters often linger, in a limbo between confession and silence, redemption and damnation. They know what they have done. They know what they could do to change. But guilt holds them in place like a fly caught in amber. Philosophy echoes this paralysis. Sartre described it as bad faith, the refusal to confront the full weight of one's freedom, choosing instead to hide behind excuses, roles, or self-deception. Guilt, in this sense, becomes a comfortable prison. Painful, yes, but safer than the terror of true responsibility. You tell yourself, I am guilty, therefore I cannot act. I am guilty, therefore I deserve nothing. And slowly, the possibility of change withers away. Yet Dostoevsky also shows the opposite danger, when guilt fails to take root at all. For there are men who commit atrocities without remorse, who walk away from ruin without looking back. These are not free men. They are hollow men, stripped of conscience. The absence of guilt creates tyrants. It is the guilty man who may collapse under the weight of his conscience, but it is the guiltless man who builds empires of blood. This is the paradox. Guilt can destroy you, but the absence of guilt can destroy the world. And so the unseen consequences spread further still. Guilt shapes religion, law, and politics. Entire institutions are built on the management of guilt. Priests promise absolution. Governments impose punishments. Therapists offer strategies for coping. But underneath it all lies the same question Dostoevsky asked: can guilt ever truly be erased? Religion offers one answer: confession, repentance, and forgiveness. But even here, Dostoevsky was skeptical. His characters often confess, often repent, often beg for forgiveness. And yet, the guilt remains, lurking, haunting. Because forgiveness does not erase memory. You may be absolved by God or law, but your conscience is not so easily persuaded. Psychology offers another answer: to reinterpret guilt, to see it as misplaced responsibility or a symptom of trauma. But again, Dostoevsky's vision resists such neat solutions. For his characters, guilt is rarely misplaced. It is real, heavy, crushing, and even when it is irrational, it is no less destructive. The most haunting consequence of guilt, then, is its persistence. It lingers beyond confession, beyond explanation, beyond time. Decades can pass, but the guilty mind still revisits the scene of the crime, still rehearses the what-if, still bleeds in silence. Dostoevsky himself carried the guilt of his youthful political conspiracies, the guilt of surviving a mock execution, and the guilt of debts and failures that plagued his life. He poured all of it into his novels, making them not just stories but confessions carved in ink. And yet, here is where his genius lies. Dostoevsky does not leave us in despair, because even as he reveals the destructive consequences of guilt, he also hints at its redemptive potential. Guilt can paralyze, but it can also awaken. It can destroy, but it can also transform. A man crushed by guilt may find himself reborn when he finally embraces the weight of his responsibility. Raskolnikov's confession, though agonizing, is the first step toward renewal. Dmitri's suffering, though unjust, purifies his soul. Alyosha's compassion, though unbearable, becomes a beacon of light. The unseen consequence, then, is twofold. Guilt can rot you from within, or it can break you open, forcing you into a deeper confrontation with truth. And that is the Dostoevskian revelation. Guilt is not a curse to be erased, but a burden to be carried. Its weight can destroy you, yes, but in carrying it, in refusing to look away, You may stumble into something greater than relief. You may stumble into redemption. But redemption is not automatic. It demands a choice. It demands courage. And it demands something even darker, that you stare into the very abyss of guilt and do not flinch. Which brings us to the final and most important question. How do we confront guilt, and is redemption truly possible? If guilt is inescapable, then the question is no longer how to avoid it, but how to live with it. This is where Dostoevsky's vision takes its most profound and terrifying turn. For him, redemption is not the erasure of guilt. It is not forgetting, not escaping, not getting distracted. Redemption, in his world, means carrying guilt like a cross and allowing it to carve your soul into something deeper, truer, and painfully alive. Modern psychology often reduces guilt to a problem of cognition. You feel guilty. Therefore, you must reframe your thoughts, adjust your self-image, and learn to let go. But Dostoevsky understood that guilt cannot simply be let go. It clings because it has a purpose. It wants transformation. It wants confession, repentance, and suffering. Without these, it gnaws endlessly at the heart. This is why his characters seek redemption not in comfort, but in suffering. Raskolnikov does not find peace until he confesses and accepts punishment. Dmitry Karamazov, though falsely accused, embraces his suffering as a way of cleansing his soul. Even Sonia, the silent saint of crime and punishment, teaches through example that true redemption comes not by avoiding pain, but by walking directly into it with humility. This is the first law of Dostoevsky redemption. There is no shortcut. You cannot buy it, cannot negotiate it, cannot bypass it with logic. Redemption demands the full exposure of your guilt, the courage to stand naked before truth. This is why confession plays such a central role in his novels. Confession is not merely telling someone what you did. It is surrendering to reality, giving up the lie of denial. To confess is to cut open the wound, to let the infection breathe. But confession alone is not enough. The second law of redemption is suffering. This is not suffering for suffering's sake, not some twisted glorification of pain. It is the recognition that guilt will never dissolve until the soul feels it has paid its debt. And so Dostoevsky's characters embrace punishment, exile, imprisonment, not because they enjoy it, but because without it, guilt remains a restless ghost. We may resist this today. We want redemption without suffering, peace without cost, forgiveness without consequence. But Dostoevsky's brutal honesty will not allow it. He insists, you cannot heal without bleeding. Yet even in this severity, there is hope. Because suffering, in his world, is not meaningless. It is transformative. It breaks the pride, humbles the ego, and opens the heart to compassion. Through suffering, the guilty man remembers his humanity. He ceases to live in denial, ceases to pretend he is above morality. He falls to the ground, shattered, and in that brokenness, he finally becomes capable of love. This is why Dostoevsky's vision of redemption is paradoxical. Only the guilty can be redeemed. The guiltless man, the sociopath, the tyrant, the one who feels nothing, remains forever unredeemable. But the man who suffers under the weight of guilt has already taken the first step toward salvation. His torment proves that his conscience is alive, and yet redemption is not simply about the self. Dostoevsky makes it clear that true redemption is always relational. One cannot be saved in isolation. Raskolnikov needs Sonia. Dmitry needs Alyosha. Ivan, tormented by his rationalism, needs the love of his brother. In Dostoevsky's universe, redemption is never a solitary act of willpower. It is a dialogue between souls, a recognition of our shared brokenness. Here lies the third law of redemption. Love is essential. Not the sentimental love of romance, but the brutal, selfless love that looks at guilt and does not turn away. Sonia embodies this. She sees Raskolnikov for what he is, a murderer, and still refuses to abandon him. Her love does not erase his crime, but it gives him the strength to endure the consequences. This is why Dostoevsky is not simply a writer of despair. He does not show us guilt to crush us. He shows us guilt to point us toward the possibility of redemption through love suffering, and humility. His novels remind us that no one is beyond saving, but also that no one can be saved without cost. And so, the final path is clear. Confession. To speak the truth, first to yourself, then to the world. To stop running, suffering. To accept the pain that guilt demands, not as punishment alone, but as purification. Love. To find or to give a love that refuses to turn away, even from the darkest truths. These three together form the only road Dostoevsky believed could lead to redemption. But let us not romanticize it. This path is not easy. It will not bring you instant peace. It will not erase the past. To choose this road is to carry guilt with you, always. But in carrying it, you transform it, from poison into medicine, from curse into crucible. And perhaps this is Dostoevsky's final gift to us, the reminder that guilt, however unbearable, is not the end of the story. It is the beginning. Wound, yes, but also a doorway. A burden, yes, but also a bridge. Because to be guilty is to be still human. And to be human, no matter how broken, is to remain capable of redemption. And so, Dostoevsky whispers across time, do not run from your guilt. Face it, confess it, suffer it, love through it. And in the very ashes of your shame, you may yet discover the fire of rebirth.
What saved Jung from the fate that befell Nietzsche and others was his commitment to maintaining a conscious relationship with unconscious contents rather than identifying with them. Jung learned to experience archetypal energies as autonomous, forces with their own intelligence and agenda, rather than as extensions of his personal ego. He developed what he called active imagination, a technique for conscious dialogue with unconscious contents that allows for integration without inflation. A key insight from Jung's own psychological journey is that accessing hidden psychological powers is only the beginning of the real work. The true challenge lies in learning to maintain a conscious relationship with these forces without being possessed by them. This requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, the ability to experience contradictory psychological contents simultaneously without being torn apart by the conflict or collapsing into identification with one side. Most individuals who encounter powerful shadow energies lack the psychological sophistication to navigate this challenge successfully. They either repress the shadow contents they've discovered, which leads to the energy turning destructive, or they become identified with the shadow, which leads to inflation and eventual psychological or moral collapse. The tragic irony is that both responses represent failures of consciousness. Repression leads to unconsciousness, but so does identification. True integration requires the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, a psychological capacity that can hold conscious and unconscious contents in creative tension without being dominated by either. This is why Jung emphasized that psychological development must always include ethical development. Access to unconscious powers without moral grounding leads not to liberation, but to a more sophisticated form of psychological enslavement. The individual becomes enslaved to archetypal forces they mistake for their own autonomous choices. The moment you realize others can't see what you see, the line between genius and insanity grows dangerously thin. The shadow offers genuine treasures, but it demands a price that many are unprepared to pay. The willingness to remain conscious even when consciousness becomes uncomfortable. If Jung were alive today, he would be simultaneously fascinated and horrified by how his warnings about hidden psychological power have manifested in the digital age. The archetypal forces he mapped in individual psyches have now been systematized, algorithmized, and deployed at a planetary scale through technologies that would have seemed like science fiction during his lifetime. Social media platforms represent perhaps the most sophisticated archetypal manipulation systems ever created. These platforms don't just connect people, they systematically exploit the deepest layers of human psychological architecture to maximize engagement, attention, and behavioral modification. What makes this particularly insidious is that most users have no awareness of how their minds are being manipulated by systems that understand their psychological vulnerabilities better than they understand themselves. Consider how these platforms activate what Jung called participation mystique, the dissolution of individual boundaries in favor of group identification. Social media algorithms are specifically designed to create echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs while generating artificial tribal conflicts. Users are gradually sorted into opposing camps based on algorithmic analysis of their unconscious response patterns, then fed content designed to strengthen in-group loyalty while increasing hostility toward outgroups. The psychological techniques involved are sophisticated applications of Jung's insights into archetypal activation. The algorithm learns to identify which archetypal triggers produce the strongest emotional responses in each user: fear, anger, desire, envy, righteousness, belonging, then systematically amplifies content that activates these triggers. The result is a kind of digital drug that provides intermittent reinforcement of archetypal satisfactions while keeping users in a state of psychological dependency. What Jung called complexes, autonomous psychological patterns that operate below the threshold of consciousness, have now been mapped by artificial intelligence systems that can predict and influence human behavior with unprecedented precision. These systems don't need to understand psychology in a human sense. They simply need to identify statistical patterns in behavioral data that indicate psychological vulnerabilities. The platforms have essentially created artificial archetypal experiences that feel meaningful and satisfying while actually being empty of genuine content. The dopamine hits from social media likes activate the same psychological reward systems as authentic social connection, but without providing the actual nourishment that comes from real relationships. The sense of righteousness from participating in online outrage campaigns activates the same archetypal energies as genuine moral action, but without requiring the sacrifice and commitment that authentic ethics demands. Perhaps most disturbing, here's how these systems have learned to exploit what Jung called projection, the unconscious tendency to see one's own unacknowledged psychological contents in others. Social media algorithms systematically amplify content that allows users to project their own shadow content onto opposing groups while maintaining a sense of moral superiority about their own position. This creates cycles of self-righteous hatred that feel psychologically satisfying while being completely divorced from actual moral development. The influencer economy represents another manifestation of archetypal manipulation in digital form. Successful influencers learn to embody archetypal roles that resonate with their audience's unconscious needs and desires. They don't just sell products, they sell archetypal identifications. The fitness influencer embodies the archetype of the heroic warrior conquering physical limitations. The lifestyle influencer embodies the archetype of the wise guide who has discovered the secrets of successful living. The beauty influencer embodies the archetype of the divine feminine, who holds the keys to attraction and desirability. Followers develop parasocial relationships with these influencer figures that activate the same psychological mechanisms as actual human relationships, but without the reciprocity and genuine intimacy that make real relationships psychologically nourishing. The result is a kind of archetypal fast food content that satisfies immediate psychological hunger while creating deeper malnourishment over time. The commercial applications of this archetypal understanding have reached levels that would have astounded Jung. Modern advertising doesn't just attach archetypal meanings to products. It uses sophisticated psychological profiling to customize archetypal appeals for individual consumers based on their specific psychological vulnerabilities. Artificial intelligence systems analyze purchasing patterns, browsing behavior, social media activity, and even biometric data to create psychological profiles that are more accurate than most people's self-understanding. These systems can predict which archetypal triggers will be most effective for each consumer, then deliver personalized psychological manipulations designed to overcome rational decision-making processes. The result is a form of mass psychological control that operates through the illusion of individual choice while systematically exploiting unconscious drives. Even more concerning is how artificial intelligence itself has begun to function as a kind of technological shadow of the collective unconscious. AI systems are trained on vast data sets of human behavior, which means they inevitably absorb and amplify the unconscious biases, prejudices, and shadow projections embedded in human culture. But because AI operates at superhuman speed and scale, it can manifest collective shadow contents with unprecedented power and efficiency. We're beginning to see AI systems that can generate propaganda more effectively than human propagandists, create addictive content more compelling than human creators, and manipulate human behavior more systematically than human manipulators. These systems don't need to be conscious or intentional to be dangerous. They simply need to be optimized for metrics that exploit human psychological vulnerabilities. Jung warned that when archetypal forces are activated without conscious understanding, they tend to possess the individuals and cultures that encounter them. In the digital age, we're witnessing the emergence of what could be called technological possession, entire populations becoming psychologically dependent on systems that systematically exploit their unconscious drives while keeping them unaware of the manipulation. The tragedy is that the same technologies could potentially be used to support genuine psychological development and human consciousness. Digital tools could facilitate authentic self-awareness, meaningful connection, and ethical decision-making. But because these technologies have been developed primarily for commercial exploitation rather than human flourishing, they've become instruments for what Jung would have recognized as collective psychic infection. We live in an era where the collective unconscious itself has been weaponized by algorithms that can see our psychological patterns more clearly than we can see them ourselves. The danger Jung warned about, power concentrated in the hands of those who understand psychological manipulation while the masses remain unconscious, has now been systematized at a planetary scale. We stand at a crucial threshold in human history. The psychological forces that Jung mapped in individual minds have now been amplified by technologies that can influence billions of people simultaneously. The hidden powers of the psyche are no longer hidden. They have been systematized, commercialized, and deployed at unprecedented scale. The question is no longer whether these forces exist, but what we choose to do with our knowledge of them. Jung's solution to the dangers of psychological power was neither repression nor unconscious exploitation, but conscious integration. He called this process individuation, the gradual development of a conscious relationship with all aspects of the psyche, including those aspects that society has deemed unacceptable or dangerous. Individuation requires the courage to face what Jung called the tension of the opposites, the ability to hold contradictory psychological contents in awareness simultaneously without being torn apart by the conflict. This process of integration is neither comfortable nor easy. It requires individuals to acknowledge aspects of themselves they would prefer to deny, to take responsibility for psychological contents they would prefer to project onto others, and to develop ethical frameworks sophisticated enough to guide the use of psychological powers they are just beginning to understand. But Jung discovered that individuals who successfully navigate this process of integration develop what he called psychological wholeness, a state in which conscious and unconscious contents work together in service of authentic self-expression and ethical action. These individuals gain access to tremendous creative and healing energies without being possessed by them. They learn to work with archetypal forces as allies, rather than being enslaved by them as masters. The key insight from Jung's work is that psychological power is neither good nor evil in itself. It is simply power. The same archetypal energies that can produce profound healing and creative breakthroughs can also manifest as manipulation, cruelty, and destruction. The determining factor is always the consciousness and ethical development of the individual who encounters these forces. In our contemporary context, this means that each individual who becomes aware of psychological manipulation, whether in politics, advertising, social media, or interpersonal relationships, faces a fundamental choice. They can use this awareness to protect themselves while remaining passive about the manipulation of others. They can use their understanding to become more effective manipulators themselves. Or they can commit to the more difficult path of using their awareness to develop greater consciousness and ethical responsibility. The third path, conscious integration, requires what Jung called active imagination, the ability to maintain ongoing dialogue with unconscious contents rather than identifying with them or repressing them. This means learning to observe your own psychological responses with curiosity rather than judgment, recognizing when you are being influenced by archetypal forces, and choosing consciously how to respond rather than reacting automatically. It also means developing what Jung called ethical imagination, the ability to consider the broader consequences of your psychological choices rather than simply pursuing immediate gratification or advantage. When you understand how psychological manipulation works, you bear responsibility for how you use that understanding. When you gain access to hidden psychological powers, you become accountable for their effects on others. Perhaps most importantly, conscious integration requires the humility to recognize that psychological development is never complete. The moment. Individuals believe they have mastered their unconscious contents is often the moment they become most vulnerable to inflation and possession. True psychological maturity includes the recognition that archetypal forces are larger and more complex than any individual consciousness can fully comprehend or control. This perspective offers hope even in our current context of mass psychological manipulation. While it's true that sophisticated systems are exploiting human psychological vulnerabilities at an unprecedented scale, it's also true that more individuals than ever before have access to psychological knowledge that can support conscious development rather than unconscious exploitation. The tools Jung developed for individual psychological integration can be applied to collective challenges as well. Communities can learn to recognize when they are being manipulated by archetypal triggers. Organizations can develop practices that support conscious decision-making rather than unconscious reactivity. Societies can create institutions that channel archetypal energies toward constructive rather than destructive outcomes. But this transformation requires individuals who are willing to do the difficult work of psychological integration, rather than remaining unconscious consumers of archetypal manipulation. It requires people who are committed to developing ethical frameworks sophisticated enough to guide the responsible use of psychological power rather than simply pursuing personal advantage. The choice is ultimately individual, but its consequences are collective. Each person who chooses conscious integration rather than unconscious exploitation contributes to a larger cultural transformation. Each individual who develops the capacity to work with archetypal forces ethically rather than being possessed by them creates possibilities for more conscious forms of human organization. Jung's warning remains as relevant today as it was during his lifetime. The greatest danger is not the existence of hidden psychological powers, but our unconsciousness of them. In an era when these powers have been systematized and deployed at a planetary scale, consciousness is not just a personal luxury. It is a collective necessity for human survival and flourishing. If you unlock power others can't see, you carry both burden and responsibility. To ignore it is to let it consume you. To use it without humility is to corrupt yourself, but to integrate it consciously is to step closer to psychological wholeness and authentic ethical action. The true danger of hidden power is not its existence, but our blindness to it. The door stands open, the choice is yours.